Mountain men slept on bare snow through the coldest nights of the year and still woke up warm. I'm Cole Hartwell, and I've spent 50 years in the northern Rockies, 19 of those winters alone down to 50 below some nights. I can tell you it wasn't luck. It was a habit most folks stopped teaching their sons. My grandfather Amos was one of the ones who still knew it, and one of the few who still taught it. He handed it to me plain. The whole system comes down to 4 ways a body loses its own heat. Miss just one of those 4, and it was never the storm that got him. It was the one leak he forgot to plug. I'll tell you which. One of these 4 is the one that catches men who've gotten everything else right. And when I do, most of you are going to recognize it as something that's already happened to you. The temperature that night never killed anybody. Not once, not ever. What kills a man in the snow is how fast his own body gives its heat away. And there are exactly 4 ways that happens. Cold comes in from the ground he's lying on. It gets stripped off him by moving air. It radiates straight up out of his skin into the open sky. And it evaporates off him the moment he's wet, whether that's sweat, snowmelt, or his own breath. Doctors have a name for the point where this goes too far. Drop a man's core temperature below 95 degrees and you've got hypothermia. And past that line, his heart, his brain, and his blood all start failing him at once. In still air with little wind, the largest share of a man's heat bleeds out through that 3rd leak, radiation straight into the dark. Getting wet accounts for close to 1/4 of the rest, and the remaining piece splits between the ground under him and the wind around him. 4 leaks, and every one of them does damage at the same time, all night long. None of that happens quietly all at once either. First comes the shivering, then the fumbling hands, then words that don't come out quite right anymore. Keep losing heat past that point, and the shivering stops, which sounds like good news and is actually the worst SI gene there is, because a body that's quit shivering has quit trying to save itself. A modern camper solves this with 1 trip to the store. He buys a bag rated to some number on a tag, zips himself in, and hopes the tag was honest. A mountain man never had that option, and never wanted one, because he didn't own a single piece of gear built to plug all 4 leaks at once, so he didn't go looking for one, he plunged them one at a time, with whatever the land handed him that day. The trees for a windbreak, the boughs under his back, the fire at his feet, the dry socks saved just for sleeping. That's the whole shape of what's coming. No gear list, no product to sell you. 4 leaks, 1 sequence for shutting them off, in the order a man actually has to deal with them the moment he decides to stop walking and lie down for the night. Before he cut a single bough or built anything at all, a mountain man picked his spot. And he did it while there was still enough daylight left to actually see the ground he was choosing. That's the first move in the whole sequence. And it happens before anything else. Wind is the enemy here. Because moving airstrips heat off skin far faster than still air ever could at the same temperature. A ridge might look like the smart choice. Good view, clear ground, feels open and safe. And it's usually the worst spot on the whole mountain, because those exposed ridgelines catch every gust that comes through and turn a cold night into a brutal one. So he'd tuck in behind a stand of trees, a pile of deadfall, or a shoulder of rock instead, anything solid enough to break the wind and hold it off his body while he slept. Before he ever committed to a spot, a man would test the snow with a bare hand, feeling for dry, powdery drifts instead of the damp, granular kind, because dry snow packs into stable walls and beds that actually insulate, while wet snow just turns to ice and works against him. Here's the part that trips up most people who think they already understand this. The valley floor looks sheltered, tucked down low, out of the wind, and it's exactly the wrong place to bed down. Cold air is heavier than warm air, and on a clear night, it drains downhill and pools in those low spots the same way water would, turning the valley bottom into what old hands would just call a frost pocket. Camp there and a man's traded wind for a puddle of the coldest air on the whole mountain, and it settles in right on top of him the second the sun goes down. Get that first choice right. Tucked behind a windbreak, off the exposed ridges, above the frost pockets, and a man's already fighting off one of his 4 leaks before he's laid down a single pine buff. That's real ground gained for free. But picking the right patch of dirt only handles the wind. The ground itself, the actual dirt and snow a man's about to lie down on, is a different animal, and it's the one leak that decides almost everything else that follows. Here's the one thing that decides more than anything else whether a man wakes up in the morning. The ground pulls heat out of a body faster than the air around him ever will. Lie down directly on frozen dirt or bare snow, and it doesn't matter how many layers a man's got wrapped around his chest, because that cold pulls straight through his back the whole night, 1 degree at a time, and it never once lets up. I'm not guessing at any of this. I paid for it. So a mountain man never touched the ground with his bare body if he had any say in the matter. He built a bed first, not a soft one for comfort, a thick one for survival. A raised mattress of evergreen boughs, packed tight, close to a foot thick, sometimes more, between his back and the snow underneath him. Pine, spruce or fir, whatever grew close by. The 1800s version of an insulated sleeping pad. Without it, nothing else in this whole system works. Here's the why. And it matters, because a rule you don't understand is a rule you'll break the first hard night you're tired and rushing. Those boughs aren't warm. They don't hold any heat of their own. What they hold is air. Thousands of tiny pockets of it trapped between the needles and the twigs. And trapped air is what actually stops the cold from reaching him. It's the air doing the work, not the wood. Pile up anything without that same structure. Wet leaves, flat bark, packed snow itself, and a man loses that trapped air along with the insulation it was giving him. Building it right took a little care. Bigger branches went down first, laid like shingles, because they held the structure and kept the whole bed from compressing flat under a man's weight. Then smaller, fluffier boughs went on top of that base, packed in dense until the whole mattress ran close to a foot thick, sometimes more. Lay a hand flat on a bed built like that, and it gives a little, springs back, and never once lets a man feel the snow underneath. And here's the part that runs backward from how most folks think about staying warm. It's better to put your insulation and your hides under your body than piled on top of it. Cover yourself in blankets 3 deep and skip the bed underneath, and you'll still wake up cold and confused, because those covers on top can't do a thing to stop the heat draining STRA down into the ground below you. Put the same materials underneath instead, and a man's choked off the exact leak that was killing him the whole night. More under than over, every time. Men who had them layered animal hides into that same bed, a thinner one on the bottom against the boughs, a heavier buffalo robe up near the body, because fur works the same trick as the boughs, trapping air close against the skin instead of holding any heat of its own. That's the ground handled, the single biggest leak in the whole system finally plugged. But solving the ground doesn't solve everything about the space around a man's body. And if he builds any kind of shelter at all over that bed, the next mistake waiting for him is building it too big. He was the only furnace in the whole operation, and a furnace that size can't heat a room the size of a cabin. Build a shelter too roomy, and all that space just swallows the little heat his body puts out, and he sleeps just as cold as if he built nothing at all. So the rule of thumb was simple. Keep the shelter about 3 times a man's own body size, or smaller, snug enough that it almost feels too tight when he first crawls in. That tightness is the whole point, because every extra cubic foot of air in there is air his body has to warm using nothing but its own heat, and he only has so much of that to spend. And here's the part that sounds backward until you've actually tried it. Snow itself, the same stuff that's trying to kill him, becomes his best tool the moment he traps it around a small enough space. A well-built snow shelter can hold right around freezing on the inside, even when it's 40 below outside, because packed snow insulates far better than open air ever does. That's not a small difference. That's the gap between a survivable night and a fatal one made out of nothing but snow a man was already standing on, snow deep enough to work with. 4 or 5 feet of it let him carve a chamber with the entrance dug slightly below the sleeping platform. That kept the warmest air rising and trapped up where his body actually was, while the coldest air sank down low and drained back out the way it came in. Now, here's the one rule in this whole system that ISN optional. And I want you to hear this part plainly before anything else. Anytime you build a snow shelter, you cut a vent. Every single time. No acceptance. Because a closed-in space with a fire, or even just a man's own breathing, needs somewhere for that bad air to escape. More people have died from carbon monoxide building up inside a snow shelter than have ever died from one collapsing on them. And the same shelter that was keeping a man alive turns into the thing that quietly kills him in his sleep. Without his ever feeling it happen, get the size right and cut that vent, and the ground is insulated. The shelter is warming instead of swallowing heat, and the wind's already been dealt with from the spot he picked earlier in the evening. 3 leaks down, 1 still to go. But none of that heat does a man much good once the sun's fully down, because everything he's built so far only holds the heat his own body makes. It doesn't ADD any of its own. So he brought the fire's heat to bed with him instead of just sleeping near it and hoping some of it drifted his way. The method was simple. Heat a stone right in the coals until it's good and hot. Wrap it thick in cloth so it won't scorch anything it touches, and tuck it down at the foot of the bedroll. A stone held against cloth instead of skin keeps giving off warmth for hours after the fire itself has died down to embers, cooling slow. Instead of dumping its heat in the first hour, soapstone was the stone of choice whenever a man could find it, and that wasn't an accident. Soapstone is dense enough that it soaks up heat slowly and lets it go slowly too, instead of dumping all its warmth out fast, the way a thin piece of metal would. Pioneer households ran this same trick clear through the 1800s, heating a stone by the half and tucking it under blankets or into a wagon bed before anyone climbed in for the night. It wasn't some rare mountain man's secret. It was just how people who couldn't afford to be cold got through a long winter. A container of warm water worked the same way, held close against the body instead of at the feet, and it did double duty. It threw off heat the same as the stone, and drinking a little of that warm water helped hold a man's core temperature up from the inside too, not just warm him from the outside in. And behind the fire itself he'd stack a low wall, green logs, flat stones, whatever he had on hand, built about knee-high on the far side of the flames. That wall is a reflector. What it does is bounce heat that would have gone straight up into the dark sky, back down toward the man lying near it instead. Remember that third leak, the one where a man's own body heat radiates straight up into empty space with nothing to stop it. A fire without a reflector behind it is losing half its value to that same exact leak. Heat going out into the night instead of coming back to the person who built it. Put a wall behind those flames, and suddenly the fire does twice the work for the exact same armful of wood, heat carried to the bed, warmth held against the core, and a wall throwing the fire's heat back where it belongs instead of losing it to the sky. 3 separate tricks, off one fire. But none of it counts for much if the man lying next to that heat is already soaked through under his clothes, because wet beats warm, every single time. The last leak doesn't come from the outside at all. The fastest killer in this whole system isn't the cold a man can feel biting at his face. It's the damp he can't feel happening to him at all, right up until it's already done its work. Here's the mechanism plain. Sweat soaked into his clothes while he was working hard cutting wood, building that bed of boughs, sits there quiet as long as he keeps moving. The second he stops, that same sweat turns against him, because wet fabric pulls heat off a body far faster than dry fabric or even still air ever could. A man can be dressed warm, working hard, and feeling fine, and still be quietly soaking himself from the inside the whole time. And he won't know it until he lies down and that wet layer starts pulling the life right out of him. Even a man's own breath is part of that same leak. Every exhale carries a little moisture out of his lungs and into the cold air. That fourth leak never really stops working on him, waking or sleeping. So the discipline was strict, almost ruthless about it. Strip a layer off while you're still working and starting to sweat, before that sweat has a chance to soak all the way through. Not after you're already wet. That's the whole trick. Manage the moisture while you've still got the body heat to spare, not after you've already spent it and you're standing there cold and soaked with nothing left to burn. Boring is what surviving actually looks like. And for the actual sleeping, there was one habit that mattered more than almost any other. Keep a single dry pair of socks, set aside, used for nothing but sleeping in that bedroll. Never hiked in, never worked in, never let to see a drop of sweat all day. Come nightfall, the wet socks come off. That dry pair goes on, and that alone can be the difference between warm feet till morning and feet that never really warm back up. Something goes on the head too, because the head bleeds heat about as fast as anything else on a man's body, and a bare head undoes half the work of everything else in this whole sequence. Stay dry, and every leak plugged so far, the ground, the wind, the sky, holds. Get soaked through and skip that discipline, and none of it matters, because the damp beats every other fix in this list working all at once. Handle the moisture, and there's still one more leak left. And it isn't outside a man's body at all. It's what's going on inside him, in his own belly, and whether he's fueling the one furnace this whole system depends on. That furnace is the man himself, and like any furnace, it only keeps burning if somebody feeds it. What goes into his mouth right before he closes his eyes matters more than most people would ever guess. A dense, fatty bite of food eaten right before sleep keeps that furnace running through the whole night. And here's why. Digesting food actually raises a body's own heat production. A real, measurable effect. And FAT is the single most calorie-dense fuel there is. Pound for pound, nothing else a man can eat puts out more heat for the weight he's carrying. Eating that fatty piece of meat isn't just filling a belly, it's throwing another log on the exact fire that's going to keep him alive for the next 8 hours. This wasn't some mountain man superstition either. Traditional diets built for hard, sustained cold, the kind eaten by people who lived through real Arctic winters, ran close to half fat and half protein. Fat carries the most energy for the least weight a man has to haul around, exactly the trade a fella living out of a possibles bag was always making. Cold weather even makes the body crave fat on its own, the same way it craves water after a hard sweat. And that's not an accident. That's the body asking for the fuel it actually needs. Eat lean meat alone on a cold night, and a man's stoking a small, quick fire that burns out fast and leaves him cold again by the middle of the night. Eat the fat right along with it, and that same fire burns slow and steady clear through until morning. Now here's the flip side, and it runs against every bit of common sense you've ever heard about whiskey keeping a man warm on a cold night. Leave the bottle alone. Alcohol feels warm going down because it pushes blood out toward the skin, and that blood carries heat with it. But that heat isn't staying in the body. It's radiating straight out through the skin and into the cold air, leaving the core colder than it was before that first drink. Worse than that, alcohol dulls a man's shivering response significantly, and shivering is one of the main ways a body generates its own heat in the cold. Reach for the whiskey on a cold night, and a man isn't warming himself at all. He's quietly shutting off one of his own heat sources, while it tricks him into feeling warmer than he really is. Fat belongs in the belly, not liquor in the cup. That's the whole rule. One man alone can only burn so much fuel, though, no matter how well he feeds himself. And that's exactly why the last move in this whole sequence isn't something he does by himself at all. The last move in the whole sequence was the simplest one of all. Don't sleep alone if you don't have to. Bed down close to the other men in camp. Curled in tight, because shrinking the amount of skin exposed to the cold air is its own kind of insulation. And 2 or 3 bodies stacked close together throw off a lot more heat than one body ever could on its own. Whoever was coldest, weakest, most worn down from the day, got put in the middle of the group. Right in the warmest spot there was, because that's where the shared heat pooled the deepest and did the most good. This wasn't just a mountain man trick either. Curling several bodies together to hold heat is one of the oldest cold survival habits there is. Right alongside picking the driest wood and finding the tightest shelter. It works for the same plain reason every other move in this system works. Less exposed skin means less heat lost, no matter whose body that skin belongs to. Nobody good ever made it truly alone. That's not sentiment. Out there, it's just the math. And I want to be plain about where this move actually fits, because it only works stacked on top of everything that came before it. Sharing body heat doesn't replace a bed of boughs under a man's back, doesn't replace picking the right spot out of the wind, doesn't replace staying dry. It just adds one more layer onto a system that's already plugging those other 3 leaks. Try to use it as a shortcut instead. Skip the bough bed and just huddle up on bare snow, and the ground still pulls the heat out of every man in that pile, one after another. Same as if he'd been sleeping by himself. That's ground, wind, sky, water, fire, fuel, and finally each other. 7 moves. One system, and not one piece of it required a single dollar spent or a single piece of gear bought from a store. Mountain men beat a mountain winter without better gear. They beat it by refusing to surrender a single degree of heat they didn't have to lose. Off the ground, out of the wind, dry to the skin, fed from the inside. That's the whole system in one line. Tell me down in the comments which of those 4 leaks you'd have missed without ever knowing it. If you want more of this, subscribe and follow along. Next time I'm walking you through the food system these men ran, what they ate, how much of it, and why what most people reach for in the cold is the one thing that'll kill them fastest. Until then, mind your leaks.